Okay, there we are. I think we're about with verse 15.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Jerry, could you start with verse 15?
Okay. Gune de ean coma doxa ate estin oti e come anti pribo lau dedotai ate. And I translated it, but if a woman have long hair, it is either an honor or a glory. I put an honor to her, for the long hair is given to her in place of a covering.
Okay. All right. Cut. Auntie is in place of. All right. And this is a parabolane, and that is a wraparound, a throw around, like a mantle. Right. Probably they would, a veil, they would wrap it around their head like a shawl. Just
Well, I thought that, but the hair
like
doesn't cover the face, and so it's only going to cover around this part, you know?
Yeah.
So it must be that it can handle.
Well, we assume the
both
veil,
subjects.
when they're trying to say, well, we're assuming it's covered in the face.
Oh, it may not. It may be like a
May not.
wedding veil that
Yeah.
just covers when after you flip it back.
Yeah. The hair is given to her instead of in place of a covering. If the hair can replace the covering, then artificial covering is not necessary, except as a human custom. Now, the problem with this is there's so many little twists and turns in the argumentation. You really need to, I'm not going to spend the whole time. I wrote about 30 pages on this chapter, on these first 16 verses in my Role of Women book, verses 2 through 16, about 15 verses. And I'm convinced that this is just a custom, and her hair, I translated, but a woman may have long hair, then it is a glory to her because her hair is given her instead of a covering or in place of a covering. Now, a wraparound is what it really is. All right. Now, here's one that gets, this passage gets into some real tricky problems. So let's go with verse 16.
Right. A de tis doke belong ekos in I emes toi tain sunatheon uk ekomen ude I ecclesiae to theou. I have, what if a certain one wishes to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor the churches of God.
All right. The one deal, the structure here is this is word F right here, not highlighted, A, first word. And so this is a conditional sentence in Greek. And so we have first, second, third, and fourth class conditional sentences. We don't have a full fourth class conditional sentence in the New Testament, so we don't worry about it too much. But the other three, first class conditional sentence assumes it's true if it's true and they assume it's true. Second class, if it's true and it's not true. And the third class is it's possible it's true, but it may not be true. So it gets into kind of an iffy situation. Okay. But this is your first class condition. All right. We have no such custom. All right. The word such is something of this nature. All right? That's what it means. The antecedent for it always will precede the pronoun. So he's looking back, I'm satisfied. He's looking back at what we see in the prior verse. I'm convinced that the custom was that the temple prostitutes had their heads shaven to make them separate from the other women when they're walking down the street. So other women, a free woman would have a head of hair and a prostitute wouldn't. So no one would be accosting the free woman because she didn't have a shaven head. Does that make sense? That was just the mark. And a slave was also shaven. So a slave girl, how would she take care of not being accosted by the men? She would wear a hood over her head to cover her head. That's a saying, don't approach me as a prostitute. Does that make sense? And I think that makes perfectly good sense as to what was going on here. And there's some evidence that this was the case, right? All right, any question? But if someone seems to be contentious and they have no such custom, neither the churches of God have such custom. The custom is not in being contentious, right? Let's look at the logical structure of 1 Corinthians 11:16. If someone seems to be contentious in this matter, then we have no such custom. Someone seems to be contentious, therefore have no such custom. We can reverse it by what's called contraposition, reverse the antecedent and consequent, negate them. If we have such custom, then no one is contentious in this matter. If we have such custom, no one is contentious. Claim is made that by some that the custom is being contentious. This would violate all we know about the construction of the hypothetical syllogism. It just assumes what it's trying to prove. There's no proof of it. The instructions regarding women being veiled are either only Old Testament doctrine, only New Testament doctrine, both Old and New Testament doctrine. It has to be one of those three. What we have is in both the Old and New Testament, we find a situation. Sarah and Rebecca were not veiled. How do I know? Their faces weren't covered because the men knew they were what? They were beautiful. If their heads all covered up, you can't tell whether they're beautiful or not. That makes sense? So I know they weren't veiled and they were godly women. So we see that, and we see other women actually praying, Hannah praying, and Eli saw her lips move. So he could see her lips moving, so he could see her face. Instructions regarding women being veiled are only in New Testament doctrine. Then they're not linked with either 1 Timothy 2 or 1 Corinthians 14. Because 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Corinthians 14 are linked to the Old Testament. In fact, they're linked to both the patriarchal and the Mosaic laws. Both of them are. If you go back to Eve and then you go back to Sarah, you're patriarchal. And so that would be patriarchal. And then if you use the law says, you pull it in the law of Moses. So you got all three dispensations involved in this. So the role of women is laid out for us from Eden all the way to the second coming. And we see why it happened. The role of women was set forth in 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 14, because of man was created first. And that's the reason why. It's called primogeniture principle. Now then, we got another situation. I'm dealing with some argumentation here. I developed this much more thoroughly in my book where I explain all of these in more detail. But if these instructions in verses 2 through 16 apply outside the assembly, then women are regulated outside the assembly. If it's limited to the assembly, then it contradicts 1 Corinthians 14:33. Right? Now, he has them, women praying with their heads unveiled. Well, they can't be praying in the assembly if they're leading prayer. They could be praying if they're praying along with a man leading in this mixed assembly. I believe a woman that listens to the prayer and says amen to it, she's praying. So I believe they do pray in the assembly. But, and there's nothing wrong with them saying amen to a prayer, I don't believe. So 1 Corinthians 11 doesn't contradict 1 Corinthians 14. We know that. That's evident truth. So if 1 Corinthians 11 is limited to the assembly, then it would contradict 1 Corinthians 14. And so we have a problem there. I don't think it's limited to the assembly. If the man is the head of the woman outside the assembly in spiritual matters, then the headship argument that we get in this chapter applies, which means it would apply outside the assembly. He argues from headship, which is not limited to the assembly. It began in Eden, but before there was even a church. Okay, that's what I believe is Paul taught that everywhere. I think Paul is admonishing the church to be willing to sacrifice their liberty for the sake of saving souls. And what will a woman do? A Christian woman will go ahead and wear a covering over her head. Now, if she's a free woman and has a full head of hair, she just wears her head of hair. And if she's a slave woman who's had her head shaven because she's a slave, she wears a covering because we don't want her being thought to be a harlot. Does that make sense? That's my interpretation of it. And so we give up our liberty. Does the slave woman have the freedom because she's been forcibly shaven? Does she have the freedom to not have to wear anything on her head? I believe she does. But she gives up that liberty because she doesn't want to be marked as a harlot. And I could see the slave women wanting to have their head covered to tell the men to leave me alone. Okay, all right, I'm not a harlot. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Anyhow, all right. I've got several other arguments down here. I'm not going to spend time going to them. Let's look at women's having their head uncovered in the worship assembly, or men allowed to have their heads covered in the worship assembly. If worship in the assembly is greater than worship outside the assembly, then what is true of the worship outside the assembly? Women must be covered and men must be uncovered is true of worship in the assembly. So if it applies outside the assembly, it applies inside the assembly. That's my argument. I believe women have more limitations in the assembly than they do outside the assembly. I believe women can ask questions in a Bible class. It's not an assembly, but they are not to be doing that in the assembly. So, right. Now, if an artificial head covering proved that women were in subjection to men, if it proved that, then why wouldn't it prove it outside the assembly as well as inside the assembly? If that was a mark of subjection, it would have to go on outside the assembly as well as inside the assembly. So the argument that it only applies to the assembly, but it's a mark of subjection, why would it only be a mark of subjection in the assembly, not outside? And here's the various words that are translated for covering. Kata, kalyptos, katakalupto, and peribolain, bolaim. Right. In chapter 32 of my Role of Women book, I'd cover this in great detail. Okay. All right. Any questions? There are a bunch of other arguments that are brought up, and I deal with them. I went through and got every every book that I could find that was written by our brethren and by even denominational people on this subject. And I tried to answer every argument that I found, just as thoroughly as I could in my book. Okay. So, any questions? All right, let's go to verse 17 now. We have a change of subject. We have the Lord's Supper being perverted. Okay. My argument is the perversion of the Lord's Supper and consequent sin thereby not only stained the one committing the sin, but it hindered the cause of Christ. Where in this context, we've been having a whole chapter or two, almost 2 or 3 chapters here, about being a stumbling block to other people. We never want to do that. Okay. So let's start here. Chris, did you read the last time?
Mm-hmm.
Jerry, could you read verse 17 for us?
Oops. Tuto de Pangelon Uk Epino Oti Uk Ace To Kraton All Ace To Aton Suner Kesthe. One of my words didn't print very well there. I put, but teaching this thing, I do not commend because it is not with a view toward the more conducive to, I think I wrote that wrong, the more conducive to good do you come together, but with a view toward the lesser. That didn't make any sense.
It's the greater and lesser. Okay. And so they translate as better and worse. Greater or lesser.
Yeah, more conducive and lesser is the way I did it.
So I gave you this charge. So I'm charging you with something. I'm not praising you because, and the word that is hoti, is because you come together not for the better, but for the worse. You don't come together for what's good, but you come together for something worse.
So teaching the thing that is coming up, not the one I just thought finished?
Yeah, it's something new now. He's changing subjects. There's another problem.
Okay, that's what all is, then it's the, yeah, we're done today. Okay.
They should have been partaking of the Lord's Supper and doing it in a spiritual way without elevating themselves. And that would have entailed love of the brethren, but they had a problem of not loving.
It kind of went through the whole, almost all these subjects are a lack of love.
Well, actually, a lot of sin, most sin is a lack of love. Okay? When you look at it.
Yeah.
And notice what he says, but, toward the end, but for the worse. Now, Allah, always, and we have it on the screen here, it gives you, it contrasts two things that are in different categories. They're not in the same category. It's like good versus evil. And they're opposites in this case, better versus worse. The inferior, that which is for the less. The greater for the lesser. What's greater, to be spiritually minded, if carnally minded, is less. Right? This is the Attic spelling, Attic Greek, the older. So it's kind of a different spelling on it than we normally see. Okay? It's from kathos, comparative degree of kathos. Paul discusses when they come together for the worse in the following verses. But in giving you this charge, I do not praise you, because you do not come together for the better, but for the worse. So I'm not praising you. I'm not praising you because that's what you do. You know, some people come together and they've got a beautiful voice and they want people to hear them sing. Well, that's probably the wrong motive. You know, I want God to see my heart sing. And I've had people say, Marion, you're not a very good singer. You don't need to be singing. And I say, but God is listening to my heart. It's the heart he listens to, not my vocal cords. Oh, vocal cords, I had some surgery and they're kind of raspy now. They will always will be for the rest of my life. I had some surgery down in that area. So I've got a raspy voice now. All right. Verse 18, if you will. He's going to explain now what he's talking about.
Okay. Proton men gar soon erkomenon umon in te ecclesia aku schismata in umin hupar kin kai minros t pistuo. I have for in fact, when you come together within the assembly, I hear that divisions exist among you, and in part I believe it.
That's schism. Say schism, division. There's two words, we won't get into them, but one of them is like a schism has just started, and the other one is it's already gone and put it separate. So there's two separate words. So that's, you get into those and see the difference in those two sometimes. That's kind of interesting. So they were starting to split the church is what they were doing. Hadn't split it yet, but they're in the process of doing that. Right. So when you're coming together, this is the assembly of the church. Okay, I hear, is the word that I hear, that divisions among you. Dissension, a rent. So if you start to tear a sheet of paper, you haven't torn it in two and completely in two yet. That these divisions exist in you, but among is a better rendering, I believe. Look on the screen up here and you can see where this Greek word is found, and I'll give you some hint for it. You can get some more information about it, but there are two words. This is one word, and then there's another word that's very similar to it. And it means to rip them completely apart, pull them and set into two pieces. Okay. So in parts, in a portion, I believe this. I'm convinced it's true. Question, Jerry.
Oh, the in part is that I believe this in part, or is it part of the schism?
It's meros. It's a due portion of part. Okay.
I put into some measure, I believe it.
That's all right. Some measures, okay. Not a problem with that.
Suddenly thought, well, maybe that was
I
part
have
of the
some
division,
evidence
so it means it's not completely divided.
draw this conclusion.
It's not. It's
I translated for indeed. When you come together in the assembly, I hear the divisions exist among you, and I partly believe it.
where does the proto the first proton?
Well, I don't have it in my translation, do I?
I just put for indeed first. When you are coming together in the assembly, I hear divisions exist among you.
Add the word in there. I left it out. It's taken away from God's word. It's not a good idea. The translation took it out.
I don't know how
I'll
to
fix
do
that.
I replaced the in fact with the first, for in fact, or first. I almost wanted to go firstly, but it's not an adverb. Or first of all.
Okay, I'll get it in there tonight. Fix that. Right. Verse 19. I'll just go back and forth and
Yes.
change that.
Whose turn?
It's your turn.
Is mine? Okay. De gar kai I reses in humen enai hina oi dokimoi, phaneroi, genontai, in humin. For there must also be factions among you, so that the approved ones among you may have made themselves known. It could be worded better than I did. That's what I.
Okay. This faction is a choice. So you've chosen sides. I like to think of it like that. I remember when we were boys, we played baseball and we'd choose up sides to get a team. And if you were the last one chosen, you weren't a very good player. Okay. So there'd be two guys that become captains of the team, and they'd choose players to be on their team. Play baseball. So, but you're choosing sides here. That's a faction. So among you, there's this choosing of sides. Factions can exist in the church. One might have a faction. I have my favorite school, and I don't really think that the people that didn't go to my school can be sound. There must be something wrong with them. See, that's a bad way of thinking. And even if a school is known for teaching an error, the person coming out of it might not believe that error. So you have to be real careful in labeling and putting them in categories like that. You have to have evidence, I believe of it. Joshua called upon Israel to make a choice, and in the Septuagint version, manuscript A, it's the same word here. It's a verb form of it, however. Choose you this day, okay? Choice must be based upon a rational interpretation of the scriptures, however. And of course, Moses did choose, Hebrews 11:25, and so he made a choice. We see that there. That they that are approved, the approved ones, the ones that have been assayed and proven to be sound and be proper, may be made manifest or clear. You can see who they are. If we have two sides, didn't Moses say who's on the Lord's side? At the golden calf, I think he called upon them. Who's on the Lord's side? So when you have a choice here, and there's only two choices, you're either with God or against God. So that's how that some are made manifest. Those that are with God will be made manifest. Those that stand and do what's right. That's how I interpret it. Any comments?
This may have become themselves known. This is the genontai is aorist middle subjunctive, and so they are doing it so it's a middle, but it's also a question, and I couldn't figure out how to make a question out of that.
Well, how do you get it to be a question?
Because the genontai, I've got aorist middle subjunctive, third person plural.
That doesn't make it a question, though.
Subjunctive in it with their will.
It is middle voice, there's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a pronoun that would be a question. And the translators, the compilers of the text, did put a semicolon on it.
So it could be subjunctive without still being a question?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
It's just a possibility. I translated for there must be also factions among you, that they that are approved, and I put by God in the
Oh, you
italics.
put the may make themselves. That's where you got yours in there. Subjunctive was may, so that's where it's a possibility. Oh, I put that in there too. May have made themselves known. So I made it middle.
Okay. Any other questions? So they made themselves, by their actions, they made themselves manifest.
Well, and then
By
the
their works, you're gonna know them.
but so do the unapproved ones.
Yeah, the approved and the unapproved, both of them.
But if they're talking to the unapproved ones, he's pointing out that those others are the approved, and you should be able to see them.
You didn't be like them, the ones that are
It's
taking
a
the
strange
Lord Supper
word.
seriously.
I guess in the Greek that sounded better than in the English. It's really hard to get that out of the English.
We, in the middle sense, we cause ourselves to be saved or lost by our actions. We make ourselves clear as to what we're like by our actions. By their fruits, you know them. See? So whenever we produce good fruit, that's good sign. Okay, verse 20. Any questions?
Yeah, my turn. All right. Soon, Turko Minon, Un, Umon, P, To, Ato, Uk, Esten, Kuriai Kon, Diponon, Pagin. When the church assembles together in one place, is it not the Lord's Supper you eat?
You put is it not instead of it is not?
Oh, is it not? Oh, it is the Lord's Supper you eat. It is. Yes, it is. So it is.
I put it is not.
It is not the Lord's Supper.
The Lord's Supper to eat, because they weren't doing that. They were having a meal.
We're making it into a common meal.
But I kind of know how that probably got started too. I mean, I
Yeah,
had
they
an
probably,
idea.
some of them may have argued it's like the Passover.
Yeah, and at the end of one of the Passover feast meals was when Jesus initiated it. And so if you're going to do it the same way Jesus did, you got to have a feast first, and then at the end of it you do that. And so I could easily see how they would slide into that, you know.
And, you know, the background, Jewish background, you don't take all the trappings that were under the law of Moses and put them into the New Testament, see? Because
But they lived it and they were used to it, so for them it would have been almost automatic to even think that way. And you'd have to, that's baggage you have to get rid of.
I think he's defining, let me digress just a moment here. I think he's defining what an assembly is. When you all come together in one place. I don't think one Sunday morning when we have an adult Bible class and the children are off in their Bible classes, I don't think that's an assembly of the church. Because the whole church is not called together. So you assemble yourselves together. You all come together into one place, and someone said, well, what if someone's sick? They're excused from being there by God. God doesn't hold them responsible for being there. And the ones that are responsible for being there are supposed to be there. If they're all there, everything is exactly what God wanted. The sick ones are at home, trying to recover, and the other ones are in the assembly.
The ones that are chastised for not being there are the ones who have made it a habit.
Yeah. We see that, of course, in the Hebrews, of course. Nowadays, defined an assembly, I believe, the church comes together in one place. That's why I believe the rules regulating a Bible class are not necessarily the same as those in the assembly of the church. I believe a woman can teach children and women in a Bible class. But they can't teach in the assembly of the church if it's a mixed assembly. I would argue that women, if there's no men in the assembly, and women could do all 5 acts of worship and do it, be right. That would be my argument. Okay, any questions?
Even
But
if,
if a man walked into the assembly and he was a Christian man, he's obligated to take over all the work. Now, Jerry, you and your dad visited congregations where
It was all
you were
women
younger.
except for Dad and I, and we did everything.
Yeah.
They said, we normally do all of this, but you have the option of not being here or taking over. That's what they said. I said, okay, we'll take over.
it was women-only congregation.
mm,
That's all they had was women. So they told us, as you take over, well, that's fine with us, but we're not gonna be running the congregation and preaching and teaching with you men in the assembly.
mhm.
Women were thinking right. I believe they had it exactly right. Those older women knew their Bible pretty well back then. And they seem to know it, may have known it better than they do it now. They didn't watch TV as much, did they? Okay. So they come together in one place. That's why I argue they're different. Paul regulates the assembly in chapter 14, and we'll get to 1 Corinthians 14, 33b through 36 later. I believe this, we learn that the Lord's Supper is to be taken in the assembly. It says it's an act that is done by the assembly of the church. I object to it being done in a separate room, as some congregations do. I don't think you need to take it home if someone's sick. They're not obligated to partake of it.
Well, that kind of brings a question in my mind. That's something that I see a lot, and younger did more of that, where if someone was long-term ill, they would request the Lord's Supper be brought to them if they were in the nursing home or something like that.
But you could go have an assembly with them.
So 2 or more.
Yeah.
So then you would count, but then both of you
It'd like
take
be
it?
another assembly of the church, so it wouldn't be.
Yeah, but would both of you take it then?
That's how I've reasoned around it.
Yeah.
Might be twisting the Bible though, but that's my reasoning of it.
Now technology.
But if we're going to do it, we need all 5 acts of worship.
Okay.
We need to sing and pray and have the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, that kind of goes the same with the technology now. With those who are watching live, often they request to have those little to-go cups and stuff at home to partake it at home, since they're there live. They feel that that's part of the assembly. They're watching with us, and they're not gathered together in one place physically.
That's kind of debatable, but
yeah. Well, it's the technology question. I don't know what to do with it.
I know we got some problems with some of that.
Yeah.
But it appears that they all come together here,
Mm-hmm.
which they wouldn't be doing that on Skype.
Right.
Okay. If we take it to a nursing home, I think we need to have all 5 acts of worship, and we just have it as a separate assembly. The church is just a different congregation.
And we used to do that. We'd have a whole separate. It was a little bit shorter, but we did everything.
Yep.
And passed the communion.
To me, I don't have too much. I don't have a problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
But I do just take the Lord's Supper. I think you need to do the whole thing.
Yeah.
Of course, we're going to have prayer with the Lord's Supper, so we have our prayers. I think we can sing a song, and we could have a short lesson, maybe 5 or 10 minute lesson. And so we've covered it. And if they want to give, they can do that. Okay.
Okay.
All right. The problem is what congregation treasury does it go into then? The giving.
Say it again
They
now.
treat it as a separate congregation. You have to have another treasury for them.
Well, I mean, at the nursing home, sometimes they'd bring $1 or something. But, that wasn't. We didn't really pass the plate.
Yeah.
So much. They would sometimes, but they didn't have anything to do to give.
Okay. So it's not possible to eat the Lord's Supper. I don't think he's saying it's not possible to eat the Lord's Supper so much as you have what you're doing with your action. It's not really the Lord's Supper. You made it a common meal, as Jerry pointed out earlier. I think that's what he's saying. purpose was not to eat the Lord's Supper, but to eat a common meal. So they made the Lord's Supper the common meal, perhaps like the Passover meal. And that's what I have in my notes here. You can see it on the screen up here. So I think that's what they were probably doing. All right. They were not coming together to eat the Lord's Supper, but to eat a common meal. They made it into a common meal. Okay. All right. Any questions? Let's do at least one more verse if we can. That's 21.
21. Hikastos, Gar, To, Idion, De Ponon, Prolambane, En, To, Fagain, Kai, Os, Men, Pena, Post, De, Methue. Boy, my eyes just cleared up. I could actually read that. For each one takes his own supper to eat before others, and one is hungry and another is drunken.
Well, the drunken, I think, is probably not that they're drunk like you.
No, I thought satiated, but it's not really I didn't know if that word could be translated satiated or full or satisfied or whatever.
I'll tell you how I was raised. I was raised that you don't eat in front of other people without them. You cut at a restaurant. It's okay at a restaurant, but at your home, you don't eat, and there are people sitting there that come to visit you, invite them to go eat. You don't just eat in front of them. I think I was raised to think it's rude to do that.
I've been eating before when suddenly I see somebody coming up the driveway that I know, and I know they're going to talk for a while, and I just take my plate, put it in the kitchen, and go answer the door, and then the food just gets eaten later or gets thrown away.
Well,
because even just a neighbor, I just think that's
I was raised that way. And here they're taking this whole meal. The church had members that were free men and members that were slaves. How much food could a slave bring to the assembly? Probably not much, if any. Makes sense? So he comes, and this member of the church that's rich, or is just a free man. He has a whole meal, and that slave that's a Christian, he's still a brother in Christ, but he's a slave. He has nothing to eat. Why don't you just share it with him if you're going to have a meal? Is that more better? I'm sorry about that. It's not good English, but that's my way of saying it's more better, okay? It's not good English, I know. So the Lord's Supper is holy, and it's sinful to make a common meal out of it. You don't take something that's holy and treat it like it's common. That's sinful. I think they were bringing enough to be filled and totally satisfied. If each brought his own unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine, then the one loaf, one cup doctrines are unsound. Of course, they would argue that what they're doing is wrong. But I think in practice, what they were doing is they were everybody was bringing their own bread and fruit of the vine at that time. Except the poor ones didn't have anything. So what should have been happening is those that had should have been what?
Sharing.
Should have been sharing. I know whenever I went to Ghana, they wanted me to eat, and they weren't going to eat. And I just refused to do it. I said, I don't do that. I'll share what I've got with you. Okay? So, anyhow, and I forced them to eat with me rather than just sit there and watch me eat. I just was so ashamed to do that. I just completely wouldn't get it. I told them, we consider that to be rude, very ill-mannered in the United States to do that kind of thing. So they were kind of surprised. I think probably people in that part of the world just eat right in front of everybody else, and then the other ones go hungry. Well, I wasn't raised that way. Right. It appears that each family brought their own bread and fruit of the vine to take the Lord's Supper. Someone was making it into a full meal, perhaps like the Passover. That's my thinking. Any comments? And one is hungry. He doesn't have anything. I think that probably the poor and the slaves didn't have much to bring. Another satiated. I think that's how it should be translated.
Yeah, the word didn't have that in the definition in months, but I know that's what really is meant by it.
Well, if drunken means drunk with alcohol, I want you to notice what he commands in verse 22. All right, we'll get to verse 22 and then we'll close. For in your eating, each one of you taketh before other his own supper. One is hungry and another is satiated, is how I translate it. Now, my argument for it being satiated is because of what he tells them in verse 22. Right? If you will, let's take verse 22. We'll close with that verse.
I'm out, but I can read the.
Jerry, can you go ahead?
Megar oikias uk ekete es to es the in kai benaim he tes ecclesias to theo to theo kata fronete kai kata is unete tous me ekontas ti humen epo epi neso humas in tuto uk epino. For do you not have houses where to eat and to drink, or do you, and I put despise, but I don't like that word, it's irreverence, really the assembly of God or the church of God, and put to shame the ones having nothing. What shall I say to you in this? I praise you? I do not praise.
Tells them to do your eating and drinking in your own house, but if they were getting drunk, he was saying, go ahead and get drunk in your own house. I think he's talking about eating your common meal. They were making it into a common meal. And they just were filled. Have you ever eaten so much that you just couldn't, well, I say I'm stuffed, can't handle anymore.
This morning at breakfast.
Well, I bought a 1 6-pound hamburger from Brahms when I came here to the services, to the Bible class, and I ate it before class, and I only ate about half of it. Why? I was full. So I just said, I'll just go put it in the refrigerator, take it home, I'll heat it up for our meal tomorrow. But that was more than I could handle.
I'll tell you what I had, so you know why I overate afterwards. Yeah, I think that's right. And I know it was not getting drunk. That was not the point. That'd have been a whole nother sermon.
Yeah.
Another point he was going to make.
I think it's being just filled with it. I want you to look at one thing, and we'll come back to it. We have ume is emphatic not, but right here it's may u. I'll highlight it so you see what I'm talking about. May u. And so I'm going to come down here, and I deal with this in my notes that I sent you on the Greek lexicon and grammar notes, grammar and syntax notes. But Mayu is found in all of these passages right here, and it's a little different than ume. Okay? So kind of keep that in mind. All right. So we'll come back to that next week. Is that all right? Let's do that. Give it a lick at that time. Okay. Any questions?
So I'm gonna circle that and circle this.